Hi, welcome to Future Fast. And once again, we have a very interesting guest. And uh, before I bring in our guest and introduce, I hope you're enjoying Future Fast and many of you are sharing your feedbacks. I appreciate it. And some of you have also subscribed to it, continue to subscribe, appreciate it. And those of you, are majority of you are not subscribing, but you do consume podcast. While I appreciate it, I sincerely appreciate it if you could only subscribe to it because it'll keep updating you every time we bring in something new. And also do share it. And thank you once again, and hope you will enjoy this conversation. And today we have Ben Murnane. He is a editor and author, and we will hear from him about his journey to start with before we talk more about it. But of course, there are some interesting uh, uh, subject of his book, who has also been a guest. So that is one of the connecting points. Of course, we didn't connect through him, but that is one of the highlights of this conversation. So with that, Ben, thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast. Welcome to Future Fast.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited for our conversation.
So, Ben, why don't you share your journey? Where would you want to start when you have to start? This is where your journey begins, apart from Ireland, of course.
Right, yeah, the journey certainly geographically began in Ireland. I guess our connection and my connection to Future Fast is Zoltan Istvan, who is the subject of my book, Transhuman Citizen, Zoltan Istvan's Hunt for Immortality. And so I wrote that biography of Zoltan essentially, and that was just published this year. So it was a very interesting journey with him over 5 years or more, just interviewing him and kind of speaking to him and charting his journey uh, to kind of becoming one of the foremost experts in the world on transhumanism and a very well-known futurist. So I guess we'll talk more about that later, but I guess that's
Sure.
where our journey begins in the sense of why I'm
Correct.
on this show, if you like. But obviously, my own journey with writing and editing and what led me ultimately to meet Zoltan and to writing the newest book, which is about him, began quite far back. And my interest in transhumanism and kind of futurist topics began, I suppose, around the same time and for the same reason. I was diagnosed at age 9 with a very rare genetic disorder called Fanconi anemia. And what happens with Fanconi is that your bone marrow fails, and so you can't produce new blood cells. And
Hmm.
so I have relied for all my life really on medical technology and advancements in medical care in order to stay alive. And I had a bone marrow transplant in 2001. And before that, I was on steroids and getting frequent blood transfusions. And when I was growing up, the odds of surviving Fanconi were a lot lower than they are today. The average life expectancy was 22 years of age. And they would wait as long as possible to give someone a bone marrow transplant, which I eventually had in 2001. But they wanted to wait as long as possible to give me a transplant because the medical science was advancing every year. So, when I had my transplant in 2001, the odds of success were about 50-50, but that was still a lot better than they had been years prior, right? And today they're far advanced, beyond what they were 20 years ago. So
Oh, what
medical
you're saying is
technology.
50-50 is like just tossing a coin.
Right. And it's scary because I was 16 years old and I was brought into the doctor's office and I had been very
So at
sick.
16, whose decision would that be? Was it yours or was it your parents? Because in India, if somebody is 16, it would be their parents' decision.
Legally, the parents' decision, I'm sure, but, you know, I
Oh, but must
guess
have been scary for you as well as them, right? I mean, it's
for sure. And it was presented to me as a young person by the doctor as it being my decision, I guess. I mean,
oh,
like nobody was going to go forward with it if they didn't have my buy-in. At least that's the impression that I was given at the time. And it is hard because, but the alternative is, you die, right? So it's like you have a 50-50 shot at life, but if you don't take this big chance of going through this major operation, then your future is very certain and it's not very positive. So that's difficult for sure. And I guess it was so what I'm getting around to is growing up with the illness made me interested in medicine and the future and kind of advancing human life beyond maybe the possibilities that we had at the time. Also made me very much interested in writing, and writing was my outlet. It was kind of the way that I would escape from all the medical things, all the pain I was going through. You know, you'd sit in a hospital bed and you would be, just kind of losing yourself and the ability to write a short story or an essay or kind of even just diary entries where you would explain to yourself, I would explain to myself what I was going through or talk about that. So
What
my
would you write? What were you writing? I mean, do you ever look back what you wrote then?
Sure, yeah. So I actually I wanted to have readers from an early age as well, right? I didn't just want to write for myself. I wanted to explain my experience to people around me, even if it was just my immediate circle. So I actually started a magazine in school when I was 12 years old. And it was just for my peer group, and my friends. And I used to go to my dad's office and I'd photocopy the magazine every month and we would mail them out, send them out by
Oh,
post to my friends, or I would physically go around and deliver it to their houses. This is, before we all had mobile phones and the internet became what it is today. So, yeah, so I started a magazine when I was 12 years old, which is 3 years after my diagnosis. And in the magazine, I did most of the writing. Some of my friends would write for it too, but we would write wacky short stories, crazy things about superheroes or serial killers, just random, kind of politically incorrect stuff that teenagers or preteens write. And then I would also write serious stuff about my illness. And the kind of first very serious piece I wrote about the illness was ultimately published somewhere else, but that was published in the magazine, and that was about, I suppose, just the strangeness of suffering an illness that very few other people have. I mean, Ireland's a very small country. It's only 5 million people. So there were only two other families that our family knew that actually had this same illness as me. So there's this sense of isolation, a sense of maybe my friends, very few people around me understanding what I was going through. And it was all quite self-pitying, but, I was suffering at the time. And so my writing was a way to try and explain that to myself and to my friends and people around me. So I would just write about what I was going through, having a blood transfusion, the strangeness of that experience of someone else giving a part of their body to kind of save you and keep you alive. The strangeness just of being in hospital and all the kind of comings and goings, the kind of parts of life that few people see unless you're kind of in hospital on a regular basis. I was in and out of hospital every week for a period of time, and you would meet other families and you would kind of get to know them a little bit, but then you would move on. So there's kind of a strange transience to being in and out of hospital as well. So, yeah, writing was my way to explain
uh,
all those strange experiences.
Ben, uh, usually I see people, whatever little I've seen, one, people tend to be a little more religious, at least on the family front, right? Because they want to, whatever can save their family member, right? I mean, if it's your child, I mean, people will move more mountains to make sure that, right? So, one, people tend to be more religious, uh, sometimes even very spiritual, preparing themselves to be whatever is the reality, right? I mean, you can only do what you can control, but what is beyond your control, just learn to accept. But you probably were a witness to those things around you. They were also getting religious, they were also getting spiritual. How was that? I mean, how did you, I mean, since you're a writer, what was your observation about that?
Sure, it's a very interesting point, and it obviously connects to my later life. writing the book about Zoltan, who's quite a well-known atheist, and he would have seen atheism. He does see atheism as kind of a cornerstone of futurism in the sense of, if you believe that you should do what you want to your body, upgrading it with cyborg limbs and, maybe getting a Neuralink implant or so on, some of that, in Zoltan's view, requires, you individually wanting to be your own God rather than having a faith that relies on a deity external to yourself. Because it's almost like humans should aspire to become God rather than aspire to obey God. So that's Zoltan's view. So there's an interesting connection there, I suppose, later on.
Did
But
you
in
also
terms,
start thinking like that then?
I mean, I have a certain sympathy for that view, I guess. So to answer your original question, I would have grown up in an agnostic slash atheist family. My parents became quite disillusioned with organized religion, if you like, early on. Um, I'm not sure how much you know about the history, but Ireland has a
Yep.
difficult history with the Catholic Church. It's obviously an
Yeah. Yeah.
overwhelmingly Catholic country, more Catholic in times past maybe than today, but obviously there have been a lot of scandals through the decades in terms of pedophilia in the church, and
Yeah.
obviously that contributed to the waning influence of the Catholic Church in Irish life. And I suppose for that reason, among others, like bishops and priests would have had a lot of power in my grandmother's and grandfather's day, and my parents, I guess, would have reacted against that, being kind
Mm.
of 60s, 70s hippies and rebels. So they raised me and my two sisters to be, I suppose, skeptical and agnostic, and to not that we wouldn't necessarily believe in God, or I guess their answer would have been, we just don't know, but that
No,
we
but
distrust.
your health situation, did it push them towards religion? Because sometimes, those things do happen.
Yeah, but in our case, no. I could
Okay.
honestly say no. Um, I think we would see it around us. There was a chapel in the hospital where I attended. It was called Our Lady's Hospital for Sick Children. After the Virgin Mary, obviously, Catholic hospital originally in Dublin, and so we would have seen it around us, and I think it's an understandable reaction. But I, I mean, it's hard to know how I felt now when I was 9 or 10 or 11, but I can honestly say I never thought, oh, there's a better life after this one, or there's a better place. It's all for a reason. It's all going to end up good in the end because we all end up in paradise or something like that. I was never afraid of dying as such. I just saw it as it being, things are over. Nothing, the loss of all sense and thought. So that didn't scare me. So I wasn't turning to a view where I had to look at my illness as a reason that I would end up in a better life or something like that. I didn't have that view. I was more interested in living for as long as I could, I suppose, in this life, and uh, getting rid of as much pain as I could in whatever way I could. But I wasn't afraid of dying as such. I'm more interested in living without suffering.
Well, once you came out of this, it was like a second life, right? Because it was as good as the tossing of a coin. So, so did you? I'm just curious, since you are also a writer before that, did you write down that, okay, if I make it past this, these are the things I'm going to do? I mean, was there something like that?
You
Because
know,
there was always a possibility you wouldn't, right? So, did you have that? Okay, if I make it, then I'm going to do this.
honestly, I didn't think too much about the future at that time. I didn't set specific goals. So when I went through my transplant at age 16, and that was very difficult, I was 3 months in hospital, and I ended up having a very bad reaction to one of the drugs towards the end, and I had a lot of psychotic delusions, and I ended up going slightly off the rails and having kind of fantasies of people breaking into the room and all these things happening that weren't actually happening. And that's an interesting process as well, just even spiritually, like we're talking about, to kind of, you know, experience realities within your own mind and body, which are different from the kind of external reality that we all exist in. And that's something maybe we can come back to. But that was a difficult experience. Exactly like you said, I came out of it. I was actually released from hospital on September 11th, 2001, which was a very,
Which is,
very
I think nobody can forget that.
a strange day, and I'd just been experiencing all these hallucinations. And, I was watching the TV, and I had said to a nurse who came into my room, a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers in New York. They thought I was having another hallucination, nobody could
Oh,
believe it. So it was such a strange day on a personal level to be let out of hospital on that day, and then to have lost myself and lost a sense of myself because I've been going through so many different machinations in my own mind and body, and then to emerge into a world that was completely changed as well, or was about to completely change. And I think our world has changed a lot since September 11th. So it was difficult to find a way back to myself. So I wasn't really planning for the future, but I was hoping for a point when things would be set right, when I would feel back to myself. And part of that was, okay, I'll know that I'm getting better when I can write again. Because I actually
uh,
lost the ability to write. I couldn't physically hold a pen because I was having a lot of shakes, and my muscles had atrophied, and because I'd spent so long in bed, I couldn't get out of bed for weeks on end. So um, I couldn't walk really. I couldn't hold a pen. I was having a lot of shakes. And so it was like physically when I can write again, but also mentally when I feel like I'm in a place where I can actually explain a thought or write down a thought. So I couldn't, physically hold a pen, but I also couldn't mentally hold a thought straight enough for long enough to put it down on paper. So I knew that when I started being able to do those things again, that I would be getting back to myself and starting to feel better. That was a gradual process, but it really was just kind of one foot in front of the other. And my mom, my parents helped me kind of
did you
learn
have
to walk
friends those
again.
days? Because it's a odd time, right? Even for teenagers, many of them, any teenager to comprehend with another teenager in such a situation would be difficult, right? That age is such a complex thing.
It was very hard. I don't think anybody really understood. I had good friends who were, a couple of them came to visit me in hospital. A couple of them came to visit me when I came out of hospital. I had to spend a year out of school when I got out of hospital, so I wasn't able to mingle with other people because the risk of infection would be too great because my body
Correct.
was so weak, right? Um, so I didn't see people that much, but I would have friends that would come over. And they, I think, were good. And you know, I don't want to run any of my friends down because they're very good people, but I think it would be fair to say that nobody really understands unless you're
Correct. I mean, it's
going
the
through
age
it.
is such, right? I mean, they would also, it's right.
It's hard because, yeah, like you say, you're a teenager, 16, 15 years of age. Your experiences, the kind of your day-to-day life, what you want out of life is very, very different from what I was going through, say.
Right. I
And
mean, the,
so yeah, so that was definitely a sense of isolation. Um, and maybe, years later, I mentioned before we started the recording, obviously, I'm in Canada at the moment, and I'm married to a Canadian who also has Fanconi anemia. We met at a conference for people with Fanconi anemia, and it's funny because you raised the point about people not understanding and friends not understanding at 16 years of age. But there's also, even as adults, there's very few people who've been through the same set of experiences. So when I met someone who had also been through these things, and you also happen to have a mutual attraction, it it just, I suppose, is logical or makes sense at a certain level that you end up with someone who also has been through the things that you've been through. But it also says how hard it is maybe to find those common experiences. Um, but yeah,
you know,
so
well, I think when you're, I must say, super lucky at that because, uh, I mean, people with absolutely no such health conditions, two healthy people otherwise, would be so difficult to find everything going between them.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is true. But I say, it's funny how it works with Sandra, my wife. Like, obviously, the basis of our relationship is not that we both have Fanconi anemia, but the way that I like to think of it is, with anyone else or when I've been in other relationships or even with friends, you have to explain everything about your illness and what you've been through to them.
So
Whereas when
here
you
you
meet someone who's
actually
been
get away
through,
from doing it.
right, it's almost like you can start having every other conversation because I don't have to explain what this illness is and what it means because Sandra's been through the same things, right?
Hmm.
So we feel lucky. I feel lucky, obviously, to have found that connection. But it did take a long time, and it like I say, getting out of hospital after the transplant, a long process of recovery, many years of feeling very lonely, and but I was able to continue to write. I was able to find myself back to
Do you
writing,
do
and
you remember what was the first thing you wrote once you were able to write?
yeah, I put together another issue of the magazine, which was still going, or at least in theory. I think I hadn't put together an issue in about a year, but I put together an issue. Wasn't as good. It was slightly shorter, and I think probably not as high quality as the ones I'd put out before. But at least I suppose I was getting back to it. But then I was kind of continuing to chart the journey that I'd been through with the transplant, and I began to write about that in more detail. And so my first book, long before the Zoltan book, but my first book, which came out in 2008, was about Fanconi anemia. That was called Two in a Million, and that was about going through the transplant and I suppose being the first person in Ireland to have this particular type of transplant and kind of being one of very few people in Ireland with this illness, one of very few people in the world, I suppose, overall. So that's what the first memoir was about. But I, I suppose writing was always the thing that I would always come back to. I had other interests. I wanted to be an actor at one point. I studied law for about a week. I had other things I was interested in, but writing was the thing without which I didn't know who I was, if that makes sense. And so that's why I always came back to it, and I suppose why ultimately I became a writer professionally.
Well, as much as one thing that drives most people is to be that one unique person, right? Like one in a million, if you will. Well, you actually were two in a million, if you put it in that sense.
That's right. Yeah,
So,
two in a million.
uh,
Yeah, which was that's the Two in a Million was the name of the book, and that was the incidence of the disease, right? So it's two
right,
people in every million are born with Fanconi anemia.
yeah. So, I mean, do you actually make a joke about it? I mean, how do you tell yourself that? I mean, people always struggle to be that unique person, and you are born with that. I mean, aside whatever the complexities of it.
I do. I try to make a joke out of it. I think you have to have a sense of humor. I think if anybody reads the book Two in a Million, they'll see that there's a lot of humor in it. A lot of things that happen in hospital are darkly funny, and maybe they don't feel funny at the time, but you look back at them and they're very funny. I had this NG tube in my mouth and down my nose during transplant that I would get fed through, and you know, more than once, one of my parents would be in my room and they would stand on the tube that was connected to the, hook up that was feeding me, and it would fly out of my nose and out through my mouth, and there'd be food spraying everywhere all over the room. There's a lot of slapstick kind of moments like that. Um, so there are funny things that happen. I think you have to look at the
Maybe if it was a
good
comic
side.
strip, it would be funny, but in real, it's far from being funny, right? I mean, it's
Well, yeah, when it happens to you, it's not funny in the moment, but
at all.
I think you
Okay,
have
thinking about
to,
it later, you.
right. Yeah, that's it. I would say like my sense of humor or being able to look at the funny side is what has helped me get through maybe as much as anything, maybe as much as writing. Because a lot of things in life are just absurd, and make no sense. And I think unless you have that sense of the absurdity of life, it can be difficult to survive in certain moments.
Uh, what was, uh, I mean, who or what was motivating you on a daily basis to say that? I know you did mention that you are not thinking about the future because it was so uncertain, but still, uh, something must be holding together. Somebody must be holding together and giving you hope that there is tomorrow and it is going to be better than today.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think there's a lot of rhetoric from self-help gurus or whoever. There's a kind of a cliched phrase in today's culture of living in the present or living in the moment. And look, when you're in hospital and you're dying, basically, or you're suffering immense pain, there's really, unless you can think of a better future, you're not gonna find a way
Yeah.
mentally, I think, to pull yourself through. If you all you can imagine is that present moment of horror going on forever, then
Mm.
you're not going to have a will to live. So that's, I suppose, why I personally am very skeptical of live in the present, live in the moment rhetoric, because I think sometimes the moment and the present is very, very awful. And unless you can think of a future where things are better
Correct.
than they are today, you're not going to pull yourself through within your own
Right.
mind. And so, even though, as I said, I didn't really have a defined view of what that future would be, and I wasn't in a position really to set goals, I did imagine, and that vision of imagining a future that was better was one of the things that kept me going. Because I think if you can't imagine that when you're going through the worst things, then you're not going to have hope, right? And hope is one of the things
Correct.
that carries us through. So, in terms of what I imagined that to be, I suppose I imagined it the opposite of what I was going through at that moment. I imagined being able to walk again. I imagined, being able to hold a pen again. I imagined, um, writing a book, which, might get published and become successful. So I didn't have defined goals, but I definitely had a view of what I wanted the future to be, which was, to be a writer and to be published, and I suppose to be understood, because part of the reason I've written so much about the illness, like I had said kind of at the start, is to try and explain those experiences to a wider audience, maybe who don't understand Fanconi anemia so much. Um, so I definitely did imagine that future where I wasn't in pain constantly, and where I was, I suppose, getting some recognition for being a writer, and for, I suppose, if I can put it this way as well, it was writing and turning the experiences of what I was going through into a product or into entertainment or into something that could move someone else. You know, that was something that kept me going. That was something we spoke about, the religious thing. It wasn't a religious idea that gave me a sense of the meaning of suffering and the meaning of what I was going through, but
So,
I
uh,
did believe that I could create my own meaning out of
is
what I
it
was
something
going
like you
through
could
writing.
manifest by thinking about it? I mean, are you a believer in that kind of a thought process?
Well, it's funny
That you
because
manifest what you imagine, what you do?
well, it's funny that you bring it up because I've become more interested in that, I suppose, over time. My wife, Sandra, is a big believer in that mindset and that thinking, and she'd be more, I suppose, spiritual in a general sense than I am. And I would have been skeptical of it, I suppose, in the past, because I'd be like, just because you think it doesn't mean it's going to happen. You have to put the
No,
actions
but
into
what you're
practice.
saying,
Yeah.
that's the only thing that kept you alive to move forward, right? I mean, so
Oh yeah. No. So I think I agree. I think yes, in a way, you can call it manifesting. I suppose the thing about manifesting the same way as anything in life, obviously you start with an imagined future, you start with an ideal. You obviously at some point have to actually work towards it as well and do the physical actions in the real world. I wasn't in a position to do that when I was in transplant, but the idea of being in a position to work toward that future at some future point was definitely something that kept me going. So Yeah, you can call it manifesting. You can call it kind of imagining a better future, and but definitely whatever it was, kind of holding to an idea of life not being what it was at that moment kept me going.
Well, in a video, I don't remember whether it was a movie or something, where someone says that you got to believe in it as if your life depended on it, which is exactly what you did, right? I mean, because
Yeah,
it's not the case with when somebody else is trying to visualize a better day, better work, better job, better business, something, a better relationship. It's going to be very difficult to imagine so strongly as if their life depended on it. Whereas in your case, it actually did.
right. I mean, for sure. I mean, I guess the reason why I would be skeptical of that view to some extent is you also depend on luck and other people and medicine. And, it's not like I could imagine being well and all of a sudden I was. But I do think there is a lot of truth in the idea that, unless you have hope and unless you imagine that better future for yourself, it will be a lot harder to live through those very, very dark moments. And so yes, you depend on the medicine. Yes, you depend to a certain extent on luck because a lot of people just don't survive and they do everything right and the doctors do everything right, but people still don't survive. But I think regardless of what the outcome is in that moment, unless you believe that there can be a positive outcome, it's going to be a very, very difficult kind of mental journey for yourself, much more difficult than it would be otherwise.
Right. Well, is that uh, uh, your aspiration to be a writer that led you to do your PhD in English literature, right? Was that the
That's
reason
right.
you picked, or?
Yeah, that's right. I suppose, as I alluded to, writing was something I always kept coming back to. So uh, when I finished school, and I went to college. Initially, I studied drama and theater. I was interested in acting and kind of
Hmm.
being on stage and performing was also something that gave me a kind of a lot of happiness. It gave me a sense of relief. I would be very awkward or socially anxious in kind of company in general, but being on stage and you'd learned your lines and you could just kind of perform in a setting that was already pre-planned. I always found a great kind of comfort and release in that. And so I studied drama and theater in college, and for a time I thought about being an actor, and I mentioned I thought about maybe doing law after that, and but I realized I didn't really have the brain for law. Like I have too, my mind's always going off in too many crazy different directions. Maybe as a result of transplant and having those psychotic experiences and all that, but I didn't have the kind of mind to be kind of thinking in a linear way or setting things in boxes in a way that might have been necessary in some non-creative careers. And being an actor is very hard, and I was never very good at rejection and showing up at auditions and hoping that you might one day make it big. So I kind of gave that up after college, and I was just lucky at around the same time I got a job working for a company called Be Creative in Dublin in Ireland, and they produced magazines and supplements and features for Ireland's largest newspaper group. So I was working as a journalist in Dublin then for a while, and around the same time I'd finished Two in a Million and that got published. So I was lucky, but I also had always been working at writing. I thought maybe I could write and have another career or another job, but it didn't really work out that way. And so I ended up just, yeah, I suppose making a living as a writer, which I was lucky to do. And yeah, I suppose I was always, you asked about the PhD. I was always interested in academia as well. Uh, I had thought about a career in academia, but again, that's quite
As in
hard.
teaching?
Teaching,
To,
research, publishing academic papers, I suppose, working as a professor. And so that's why I went back to college and did a master's while I was working as a journalist in Dublin. And the master's then led to the PhD, which, as you say, was in English literature. And that was ultimately on quite a futurist topic. So I wrote about Ayn Rand, who's an American novelist, quite controversial in some circles, but she's a well-known and I suppose very influential American novelist. And I was interested in her influence on entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, many of whom were inspired by her novel Atlas Shrugged, which is about kind of technology and its role in human life and the human mind's role in the creation of technology. And so a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs were inspired by Rand, as were a lot of politicians on the right of the spectrum in America. And I was interested in her influence. I've always been interested in, I suppose it goes back to me writing and wanting to impact other people with my experiences. I'm interested in what happens to a reader when they read some writing and how that writing impacts their life and how it maybe changes their life. And Ayn Rand was a good case study for folks who had read a novel, a work of fiction, but then incorporated it into their lives in terms of kind of it inspiring them and maybe influencing the companies they set up and having a major impact on their life. So I was interested in studying that. And obviously, I was interested in her inspiring Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. So I was interested then in the impact of fiction on the creation of technology, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. And through that, I came across Zoltan Istvan, who we've mentioned, who had become by that point a well-known commentator on transhumanism, which is this idea that we should be more than human, that we should upgrade ourselves with robot body parts and mind implants. And so I wrote about him in my PhD in college and ended up contacting him and meeting him. And that's how we ended up working on his biography together. So that's the full spectrum journey, if you like.
Yeah. Well, Ben, how many in a million actually get to publish their book? Because I was just thinking when you were saying this, that 2 in a million was your health condition, but how many in a million actually becomes a published author?
Well, I don't know.
But it's
It's easy
definitely
enough
small. If,
these
if
days
even if it's not two
in
in a
terms of
million, but yeah,
Amazon Kindle.
it may not be 2 in a million for sure, but it's not too
Right.
big.
Well, certainly, folks. Yeah, that's fair to say. Certainly, in terms of folks with Fanconi anemia who get published, I believe 2 in a million was the first book about Fanconi anemia to be published. So that's a small little accolade for 2 in a million. But yeah, like I say, I've been very lucky. I've thought a lot about what's success or what is achieving your dream, because we all have very big dreams. Certainly I have thoughts that I'd like to have a best-selling book, and you'd like to be, more well-known, and you'd like to get all the attention and all the money. And I think we all naturally have dreams along those lines. But I've thought a lot, I suppose, recently about what I would consider to be success, or to have achieved something that I, maybe had hoped for or didn't know if it was possible when I was younger. And I suppose for me, just having been able to make a living as a writer for a number of years now, I feel very lucky to have been able to achieve that. And
That is
it could
surely
all
few in a
disappear
million
tomorrow.
can do that.
I still, right, yeah. Well, I hope more people can. I hope, podcasts like this and telling stories that people maybe haven't heard, a small few might be inspired. So I hope that we can kind of inspire people to go out there and achieve whatever they want to achieve too.
So tell me, do you believe that your PhD actually helped you being a better writer?
Yes, but in some ways, maybe not in the ways you would think. Academic writing is its own particular genre. It can be quite dense. It can be very technical in terms of the language people use. It can be sort of impenetrable to a lot of kind of lay readers, if you like, ordinary readers. And so, in a way, writing a PhD taught me how not to write for kind of an audience of people who weren't academics, if that makes sense. So, I was
Yeah.
trying to,
Would it be right if
um,
I say that uh, uh, it kind of helped you get better structured as a writer from writing fiction or a non-fiction? I mean, how would you put that?
no, I think that's definitely true. You learn maybe what not to do in terms of communicating to a more general audience. Certainly most PhDs would not make for best-selling books, and I think you understand that when you're in the process of writing it. But in terms of organizing your thoughts and just having to delve very deeply into a topic, a PhD is absolutely worthwhile from that point of
Did
view.
you go to any other writers uh, forum, get any help in how do you go about? Because these days I see a lot of people actually doing that. So, uh, did you actually take any help such?
Well, I didn't outside of, there would have been kind of coaching classes within the university in Trinity, and there would have been, literature disseminated in terms of how to go about structuring your
Okay.
PhD and writing your chapters. I suppose I had written a couple of books beforehand, and I'm not trying to, toot my own horn, but I understood how to maybe organize something that, would work for my purposes, whereas I didn't seek external help in terms of that. But what I would say in terms of doing a PhD, and it's independent of kind of the writing of it, if you like, just having to research it and having to come up with an idea, you kind of have to create a whole theory of the world. You have to almost explain to yourself how you think the world works, and so why it was that Rand wrote the books she did, and why it was that they had the impact they had on the people that they did. You have to theorize quite a lot about how you think the world operates. I think for anybody, mentally, that's a very interesting and useful process to sort of almost come up with your own theory of the world. And certainly I've come out of that experience, I suppose, a much better thinker and a much better writer and a much better researcher, just because I was lucky enough to have that period of time where you could, think deeply about these topics.
Right. Well, uh, you wanted to be an academician, but you ended up being a journalist. Why is that? I mean, what is it that you didn't like about teaching, or why didn't you go about it?
Sure. Well, I guess it was a bit like acting. It was very hard, and I'm not, I'm not afraid of hard work, but I suppose it was very competitive. Um, Certainly, it was the case in Ireland that there were far too many people doing PhDs for the number of jobs that there were available at universities,
Hmm.
right? And even though it's a global market, a lot of my friends who would have done PhDs would have gone to the States or would have gone to England. Um, you do have to be at the top of your game. I don't know that I was ever that good. I mean, obviously, I got good grades, but it's more than about good grades. You also have to kind of be doing the right kind of research that's fashionable at a particular time in a particular department. You have to network with folks who will kind of be your patrons or your peer advocates. And when it comes to getting a job, I was always terrible at that because I'm just not a very social person. So I suppose I came to a point toward the end of the PhD where I realized that there were other skills and other kind of abilities that were necessary for an academic career that I didn't have. And so I was happy to do the PhD and, get it published as a book and publish a few articles, but not to pursue a teaching career. But what I do now and what I do as a writer or what I've done as a journalist, it involves a lot of those skills. It involves research, it involves doing things like this podcast, it involves thinking about kind of big topics. So I don't feel like I've missed out. I feel like I've still been able to use those skills. And like I say, I just always fell back on writing as an end in itself. I always had other interests and other things that I was trying to pursue, but when everything else failed, I could still be a writer. So that's just where I've ended up.
So is acting still in the cards? Because I think it's quite interesting. When you were telling me, I was just thinking it's one amazing profession where you can actually be invisible in public. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah. 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 No, that's how I thought about it, being up on stage and
I mean, that's
you're
what, till you mentioned it, it never
yeah.
occurred to me that you actually are there in front of the whole view. You're on the stage and you're still invisible because what they see is not you. They see
Right.
the
Yeah.
character.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. And that's why, it might sound counterintuitive to somebody who kind of suffered from social anxiety or who's not good in kind of the company of his peers, but then is willing to be on stage and all the rest of it. But exactly as you say, it's not you, you can pretend to be someone. And also you've learned all the lines in advance, so you don't have to come up with conversation on the spot, which is always
Correct.
much harder. I still enjoy that. I'd like to do it again, even just in an amateur capacity. At the moment, I'm so busy, I don't have time, but um, I'm still very interested in drama and I'd like to get back to it one day.
Awesome. I think I'll wait for that because that seriously makes it interesting. But of course, it'll be difficult for you to be invisible because you're just not two in a million, right? I mean, you're that much more. So, uh, well, well, who or what keeps motivating you on a day to day? I mean, today, after having come through this, I mean, uh, uh, not many actually get second chance. I mean, this is amazing, right? I mean, so uh, today, what do you seek? I mean, are there people? Is it family or the book or podcast? What keeps you motivated? Or who?
I mean, certainly there are people in my life that I enjoy spending time with and who I feel keep me going for sure. I mean, my wife, obviously, Sandra, first and foremost, and friends and family. But for me, my primary motivation has always been work, has always been writing. Like I say, the thing I always fall back on, if I didn't have anything else, hopefully I would still have the ability to write or to tell a story. And that keeps me going. I'm always excited by the next project. The Zoltan book just came out this year. I'm still working now on another book, which hopefully will be out soon. That's kind of mine and Sandra's story. It's a sequel to my original book. Just two people with the same rare illness meeting, even though they're from different sides of the world. I think that's an interesting story. The next book, the next project, the next big idea, I suppose, keeps me going, keeps me motivated, keeps me interested, keeps me excited.
And you know the way to manifest it as well. So I'm sure you're
Yeah,
going to make it happen. Wonderful. Ben, thank you so much. I know it's a complex thing to talk about, revisit, and personally for me, I've never met one out of 2 million. One in 2 million. It's not two in a million for me. It's 1 in 2 million for me. So uh, thank you so much. It's amazing, and I'll just obviously want to talk more about your books and your subjects and how you go about it. But for that, the listeners and audience, you got to come back soon. And I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I did. So please feel free to share this part with anybody you think who will appreciate it. And if you're not yet subscribed to Future Path, do it right now. And till the next conversation comes up, enjoy the ride. Ben, once again, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. Thank you again for having me.